Welcome everyone, and welcome to Africam4Good, brought to you by explore.org. My name is Russell Gerber, and thank you for joining us for a little discussion about Africa's most misunderstood feathered friends, vultures. Today I'm joined by Kerri Wolter, founder of Vulpro, and it's a great pleasure to have her on the show today. Thank you for joining us, Kerri, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Russell. It's a real privilege for me.
Well, it's our pleasure to have you, and very excited to dive into these amazing animals today. And without further ado, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you guys do.
Okay, so I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called Vulpro, which stands for Vulture Program. And basically, we do absolutely anything and everything to do with trying to protect Africa's vulture species and to prevent further losses, with the ultimate goal is obviously to prevent any possible extinction on some of the species. So myself, I'm an absolute animal lover. And so I've grown up with animals, and growing up, I always wanted to do something with a species that was misunderstood and that needed a voice. So it's a little bit of history and a background about myself.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. I mean, what made you to get into conservation? I mean, I guess you've pretty much pointed that out. But specifically vultures, was it just because they were the underdogs, as it were?
It was actually by accident, to be honest. So just, I think, as everyone, wanting to get into conservation looks at a species that is a little bit more glamorous, if you want to call it that, possibly more on the predator side of things, lions, leopards. Leopards are my favorite cat species.
Me too. Me too.
But, when you beautiful. When you get an opportunity of getting into conservation, you kind of take what you can get, which is what I did. And at that stage, it was the Vulture Study Group for the Endangered Wildlife Trust. And I honestly believed it was a stepping stone of getting into another species. 20 years later, I'm still doing vulture conservation, founded my own organization. But in a nutshell, I started off knowing absolutely nothing about vultures. A vulture and a pigeon to me was exactly the same thing. I was not an avid birder by any means, but I got on very well with Dr. Katmai, who was my boss, and so he gave me an opportunity, and I learned from there. But really, what was the changing point in my life was actually raising a vulture which needed to be hand raised. Its parents weren't able to raise it. So after he was 10 days, we took him into captivity for hand raising. And that really was the turning point for me. When you had this little bundle in your hands and you start noticing the fragility of the species, and instead of seeing these birds as we often perceive them, with blood and dirt and gore and whatnot, it was a complete change in perception having this little guy in my hands, and I was responsible for his life. And that was the whole turning point for me, is actually understanding that these species are not these, crazy aggressive things, and they need us for their survival. And that was the turning point.
That's amazing. I can't imagine caring for a little vulture like that. Must have been really, really tricky to pull it off in the end, I'm sure.
It actually, it sounds a little crazy, but probably very much like raising a human baby. As long as you feed them and the temperature is fine, and they get lots of love and care, you're fine. I think there are a lot more trickier species out there than vultures, but it definitely changes a person. It's very few people have the opportunity of seeing a vulture chick at 10 days old. And believe it or not, they are actually really cute.
Well, I tend to get in trouble when I refer to my daughter as a vulture with my wife, so I try to steer clear of that as much as I can. Kerri, what's the current conservation status of vultures across Africa? You know, everywhere I go, where I take guests on safari and head out into the bush, it's often a discussion that we have, and often something that is brought up, that you often feel like you're at this incredible sighting. There's a kill and hundreds of vultures come flying in, and then I sometimes explain to people, well, there's actually not that many left. What is the current status? What are your thoughts?
Look, things are not looking good for the species. If we start naming, specific species, let's start with the African whiteback vulture, which has always been the commonest vulture species throughout Africa. They were recently uplisted to critically endangered because of their rate of decline, with the biggest threat in Africa to the species being poisoning. Inadvertent poisoning, when a lot of the targeted species, should I say, is not that of vultures, but is more of problem animals like your predators that are taking out livestock. And so those are, a carcass gets laced with poison, and vultures are getting pretty much wiped out from poison carcasses. And the problem here is you can get one carcass which potentially wipes out 600 plus vultures. So that is, things are not looking good for our African whiteback vultures, even though they are the most abundant species that you and I and the general public will see on game drives, specifically in your nature reserves. You then look at Cape vultures, which is Southern Africa's only endemic vulture species. Only maximum 4,500 breeding pairs left worldwide. They only occur in Southern Africa, but having said that, they're already extinct as a breeding species in Namibia, Swaziland, as well as Zimbabwe. South Africa is the stronghold for the species, so we need to protect them. They're found nowhere else in the world. They're classified as endangered, and then you get your bearded vultures, for example. They are very isolated species to that of the European species of bearded vultures, and if you're lucky, maybe 400 individuals in South Africa and Lesotho, if you are very lucky. Then you look at your hooded vultures, your white-headed vultures. They've been uplisted to critically endangered. Very, very few of them. White-headeds are isolated to areas like Kruger National Park. Your hooded vultures are also isolated to protected nature reserves. I myself have seen from monitoring specifically hooded vultures in private reserves that their numbers are almost being eradicated. And in a reserve where I've been monitoring them, where they used to be pretty abundant, and we always spoke about this reserve being used as almost like a creche site for hooded vultures. Now if you see 10, you are lucky. Lappet-faced vultures is a species that is, there's very little data on them. They're listed as endangered. Very difficult species to study, to research. They're solitary breeders. They are very private individuals, and I suspect the numbers are actually lower than what has been recorded. So, several species are listed as either critically endangered, or vulnerable. And then, of course, you look at the Egyptian vultures, which is a species that is extinct as a breeding species already in South Africa. So things are pretty bleak.
Yeah, that's frightening to think. I think in my career of 15 years as a guide, no more now, 17 years as a guide, I've seen an Egyptian vulture once, palm nut vulture once. As you say, you have this impression at sightings when you have this huge number of vultures arriving that everything's okay, but it's frightening to hear the numbers, and I'm sure a massive challenge, as a conservation species, because of people's misconceptions of the animal, not only the bad press they tend to get, but even, as you say, just the almost every species is in danger of disappearing. What is, to you, a common misconception about vultures?
I think something that sticks in my head is not too long ago, I was at an airport. I was flying to George for a meeting, and I had my Vulture coffee table book, and I wanted to get a hot chocolate, I was called. And so the lady who was helping me had a look at this book, and I could see she had questions, but she was a little shy. So I started talking about, this book and vulture conservation. And so the first thing she said to me is, all those birds are very dangerous. And I think that is the biggest misconception, is that they're not actually dangerous. Yes, they are big. They are on occasion scary looking, but they are so far from being dangerous to us that it is just not funny. And to me, I think that is where the biggest misconception lies, because nobody's going to want to protect any species that they are fearful of. And most people are absolutely terrified of vultures. Again, when we come across injured birds and we ask a landowner to try and secure the bird, the first thing I get told is not a chance. They are not going near the bird. They're not going to try and handle it. They are absolutely, genuinely terrified of the bird. When in actual fact, there is nothing to be scared of them. They are more fearful of us than we are actually of them.
Yeah, I've certainly seen that, out on safari. If you get too close in the vehicle even, and they're sitting way up in the top of the trees, you want to get a photograph, they get anxious quickly and fly off, compared to a lot of the other big raptor species. So, I agree with you completely. Along these similar lines. Oh, sorry, carry on.
It's quite funny. I think you can get closer to a lion than you can get to a vulture.
Absolutely right. Yeah, it's amazing. And as you say, you have this almost innate fear of vultures from, I guess, just perception and how we're brought up, stories that you read, fairy tales, things like that you always associate them with negative things, I guess. And as you say, they're such amazing animals. Along these similar lines, what is a fact or a thing about vultures that you think many people don't know?
Something I've learned is that they're incredibly intelligent and incredibly curious. But to me, the biggest interesting fact is that every single one has its own unique personality. So often we try and lump species together and we believe that they all function in the same way. A vulture is a vulture, or a Cape vulture is a Cape vulture. But every single one has its own identity, its own personality. One individual might decide to forage and fly throughout the SADC regions. Another one will be way too terrified and will stick to South Africa. Every single one is different. And to me, it's very much like human beings. We're all different. We all have our own identity. We're a mass species that's taking over or has taken over the world. But every single one of us is unique. And it's exactly the same for vultures. You cannot lump them all together. They all have their own behaviors. And if you watch them at a vulture feeding site, you will see that each one has its own unique personality. One is brave, one is absolutely terrified, one is dominant, one is more submissive. They're all very, very different.
Awesome. Let's go into the conservation side of things. We've touched a little bit on, how people being fearful of vultures makes it difficult, and a challenge for you certainly for Vulpro in conservation. What are some of the other big challenges that you can think of? And also, what successes have you had? What has made you feel good about things and positive about where we're going, at least?
Okay, look, I'm sure everyone that you have on the show will say funding is a problem, especially during COVID.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stay away from funding. I think vultures are just not liked by the general public. And to me, that is the biggest challenge we have. Again, I spoke about people being fearful, but how do you try and attract funding? Or how do you try and attract awareness, positivity to a species that is simply unliked? How can you get somebody to try and protect a species that they just don't like or they don't care about. You know, you either love dogs or you don't love dogs. And if you don't love dogs, if you see a dog running on the side of the road, you're not really going to care. But as a dog lover, you are actually going to be concerned. It's the same thing with vultures. You know, as a vulture lover and a conservationist, I absolutely care what happens to the species. Birders care about what happens to vultures. But the general public that rather wants to go to a game reserve, see the big five, they often do not think twice about a vulture species. You know, and what is happening. And to me, that is the biggest problem that we face, is a like, a simple like for the species. We all know that they're important, and you can have that theory and you can understand how important they are to the environment. But again, if you don't like a species, who cares how important they are? It's whether you are emotionally moved by that animal.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
I think you think of your sort of iconic species like tiger, panda, elephant, rhino, all animals that, as you say, you know, people have a almost innate passion and empathy for, and it's so difficult for species like vulture and even small things that, as you say, either you don't like them or you don't care about them. Much more difficult to conserve. I'm sure it's a huge challenge. But what successes have you had? I mean, what keeps you going every day?
you know, recently the IUCN sent out a circular wanting to change the listing of Cape vultures from endangered to vulnerable. And I think that is an important message here, and that is the good work that various conservation organizations like Vulpro has been doing throughout decades of work. You know, we've been going for 20 years, and we've definitely seen there are fluctuations, absolutely, but because of our work, it's had a positive impact on the species. And to me, that's what keeps us going. But not only that, making a difference in individual species lives, like our rehabilitation work, you know, where you're saving individuals, because individuals make up populations. So if you do not save each individual, you're not going to have a population to save. So for us, being able to save, rehabilitate, and release individual birds, putting them back into the wild and seeing them survive and thrive, our success rate for survival is 75%. That, to me, gives us hope, because it means that we can actually make a difference to the species. Again, our captive breeding work, where we have released 50 individuals, watching those individuals behave like wild birds, foraging, where we've released them in the Eastern Cape, and some are foraging in Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and have flown throughout those countries and have come back to South Africa and then have gone back, headed to the Eastern Cape. That gives me hope, because you actually can make a significant difference through intervention and through a full-on holistic approach. To me, that drives
That's what
me.
gets you out of bed in the morning. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. And as I said, I can't imagine how challenging it must be, but yeah, to see those good stories, I think in conservation and talking about conservation, it's so important to remind people that if you put in the work, if there's consensus, you can really move forward and you can have success. So awesome. Keep it up. On that note, while we're talking about, you know, good things, what's your most memorable vulture experience?
When I was a little younger, I decided to go abseiling to process some nestlings on their breeding ledges on the Michalisburg Mountains. So I have two memorable occasions. So that was one where I became one with the vulture in their natural habitat on their breeding cliffs, and it was two of us, and I had wild birds coming in and feeding their chicks at the same time as we were there. And that to me was, you know, it's something very difficult to put into words, because you become integrated into their world. You're not a threat. You're observing them in their natural environment. You are no threat. You are not seen or perceived as a threat by them. You are just accepted. And the other memorable experience, I think, is paragliding with them, where again, you're in their world, you're flying as a vulture. You have no motor, so obviously a paraglider is a non-motorized glider. You have a wing like a parachute, and you thermal just as a vulture thermal, so you learn how they fly, and you have a better idea as to how they actually stay up in the sky, because you use exactly the same techniques. And we were joined by 400 odd Cape vultures, which, let me tell you, is the most amazing experience anyone can have. So to be on their breeding ledges, to fly like them, yeah, I was brave once.
That's amazing. That sounds incredible. Yeah. Awesome. We're talking a little bit about injured vultures, people on their farms and in areas surrounding wildlife areas where sometimes they'll come across vultures. If they do come across an injured vulture, what should they do? We've spoken about people being scared of them, but what should they do if they find one on the road, if they're driving out on the road or on their farms?
The first thing is to stay with the bird and to call us. So we do rehabilitation throughout the country. We fully permitted. They're obviously TOPS regulated species. So the first thing is, to stay with the bird and call us when the bird is there. Often if you leave the bird and you call us, the bird has disappeared. Even a bird with a broken leg or an injured leg and can still walk, does walk and disappears, and we don't find them. Depending on how far or how close one is, either we ask you to stay with the bird until we get there, or if you're quite far and it's on a farmland, a lot of the farmers and landowners with their workers are able to capture the bird safely. We will explain how to do this in a safe manner to protect you as well as the vulture. And we ask them to secure the bird until we are able to get there. As I said, the biggest thing is to always have eyes on the bird, because they disappear very quickly. Once they disappear, it's often a very slow, horrible death for them. They either get predated, they starve to death, or they dehydrate to death, which is not ideal, obviously. So to me, that is the first thing. Stay with the bird, call us, and we will then either ask you to secure the bird until we get there, or to stay with the bird until we can get there.
Awesome. Well, leading into that, what would be your message to those out there, in terms of vultures and vulture conservation? And if they could come across a vulture, if they want to help, how do they get in touch with you guys at Vulpro? How do they find you?
Okay, firstly, we have a website, which is www.vulpro.com. You can also follow us on social media. Just Google Vulpro and you will find us. To get involved, we are always looking for volunteers, whether it be to help us rescue injured birds. We do offer training, or whether to volunteer at the center. We have the largest non-releasable collection of African vultures in the world. You're looking at 250 vultures. So we are always looking for volunteers that are keen to come and help, get their hands dirty, learn about the birds. And then a message for vulture conservation is, spread the message. If you appreciate and like vultures, spread the word. That is the best thing one can do for vulture conservation. Try and change mindsets of people. Try and change their perceptions. Let's get people to love and appreciate vultures. If we do that, we have a fighting chance. Vulpro on its own cannot save vultures on our own. We need the support from the general public. We need the support of landowners, of farmers, citizen scientists. We need people to change perceptions, to have an appreciation for the birds in order to protect them.
Amazing. And I couldn't agree more. Hopefully we've, changed some perceptions today, and, some of your wonderful stories today, Kerri, I'm sure will change people's minds just a little. And if we can get one or two, that's all we need for now. And we keep pushing. But thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your insights. And it's been a great pleasure having you on the show. Keep up your incredible work out there. And, hopefully we can continue these positive conservation stories.
Thank you so much, Russell. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. And thanks again to all of you for watching. Please join us next week for another edition of Africam4Good, brought to you by explore.org. And we'll hope to see you all again next week. Cheers for now.